Hello everyone, I am Dr. Deepa. Today we are here to learn about the auditory tube. The auditory tube is also known as the Eustachian tube. We study the auditory tube under the following headings, that is the introduction, the direction of the tube, the parts, the structure, the attachments of the auditory tube. Later on, the blood supply, the nerve supply, lymphatic drainage, winding up with the functions and the clinical importance of the auditory tube. To begin with the introduction of the auditory tube, this auditory tube, which is also called as the Eustachian tube, and it is very well known as the Pharyngotymphanic tube. It is also called as Pharyngotymphanic tube as it is a tube pharyngotympanic tube, as this is the tube extending from the tympanic cavity with that of the pharynx. It is the tube extending from the tympanic cavity to that of the pharynx. It is seen extending from the anterior wall of the tympanic cavity or the middle ear cavity to that of the lateral wall of the nasopharynx. Tympanic cavity to that of the lateral wall of the nasopharynx. So it is the nasopharynx which receives the opening of the auditory tube. So this is about the extent of the auditory tube. This auditory tube is seen to direct downwards, forwards and medially. It is directed downwards, forwards and medially. So this is about the direction of the auditory tube. Moving on to the presenting parts of the auditory tube. The auditory tube is represented by the two parts. It is represented by the two parts. Number one is the bony part of the auditory tube. Number second is the cartilaginous part of the auditory tube. As I have already mentioned, this auditory tube is seen to extend from the middle ear cavity or the tympanic cavity to that of the nasopharynx. It is the anterior wall of the tympanic cavity. So it is seen to begin from this anterior wall of the tympanic cavity from its end, which is called as the tympanic end. From the end, which is called as the tympanic end. Later on, this bony part of the auditory tube ends by forming an isthmus where the cartilaginous part of the tube begins. So the cartilaginous part of the tube is directed downwards and medially to reach, the nasopharynx, and it is seen opening into the lateral wall of the nasopharynx. Hence, the auditory tube is represented also by the two ends, that is the tympanic tube and the tympanic end and the pharyngeal end. So it is represented by the two ends. One is the tympanic end and the pharyngeal end. When we talk about the pharyngeal end of the auditory tube, the pharyngeal end of the auditory tube is located about 1.2 centimeter. It is located around 1.25 centimeter below and behind the inferior concha of the lateral wall of the nose. So the lateral wall of the nose, there is inferior concha, so it is located at, this is the inferior concha. So the opening of this pharyngeal end, nasopharyngeal end of the auditory tube is about 1.25 centimeter below and behind the inferior concha, of the lateral wall of the nose. So this is about the location of the pharyngeal end. The entire length of the auditory tube is about 36 mm. Out of this entire length, the bony part forms the lateral 1/3 and the cartilaginous part makes up the medial 2/3 of its length. The bony part begins from the tympanic end of the tube and it is reaching up till the isthmus. From the isthmus begins the cartilaginous part. This cartilaginous part ends at the nasopharynx, making up its pharyngeal end. The isthmus is the junction between the bony part and the cartilaginous part. This isthmus acts as the narrowest point of the auditory tube. So the isthmus is the narrowest. It is the narrowest part of the auditory tube or the Eustachian tube. The bony part of the auditory tube, the bony part of this auditory tube is seen to be located along the base of the skull between the petrous and the temporal part of the squamous part of the auditory tube. So the bony part of the auditory tube is seen between the squamous and the petrous part of the temporal bone. It is seen between the squamous and the petrous part of the temporal bone. Moving on to the cartilaginous part. The cartilaginous part of the auditory tube is located in the area which is present at the base of the skull called as the sulcus tubae. It is located in the area called as the sulcus tubae. The sulcus tubae is the groove present along the base of the skull which is located between the greater wing of the sphenoid and the petrous part of the temporal bone. So I repeat, the sulcus tubae lies the cartilaginous part of the auditory tube. The sulcus tubae lodges the cartilaginous part of the auditory tube, and this sulcus tubae is present between the greater wing of the sphenoid and the petrous part of the temporal bone. So this is about the location of the bony part and the cartilaginous part of the auditory tube. Next is about the structure of the auditory tube. As the name itself says, the bony part and the cartilaginous part, the lateral 1/3 is completely osseous in nature. When we talk about the cartilaginous part of the auditory tube, this cartilaginous part of the auditory tube, when we look for, it is made up of the elastic fibrocartilage. It is made up of elastic fibrocartilage. As we can see here, the one which is in blue shade, this part is made up of the elastic cartilage. It is made up of the elastic cartilage. When we talk about the cartilaginous part, the roof, the medial wall and the floor is made up of the elastic cartilage. When we talk about this cartilaginous part of the auditory tube, this is the roof, this is the medial wall, the floor is made up of the elastic cartilage, whereas the lateral wall, which is lightly shaded, represents the deficient part of the auditory tube, the cartilaginous part of the auditory tube, which is covered by the fibrous membrane. So this part is covered by the fibrous membrane. So this part of that is the lateral part of the auditory tube is covered by the fibrous membrane. So when we talk about the structure of the cartilaginous part of the auditory tube, the roof, the medial wall and the floor is made up of the elastic cartilage. The small lateral part is covered by the fibrous membrane. So hence it is called as the elastic fibrocartilage in nature. So this is about the structure. Microscopically, the auditory tube is lined by the ciliated columnar epithelium. It is lined by the ciliated columnar epithelium with the goblet cells and the mucous glands in between. So this is about the structure of the auditory tube. Moving on to the attachments of the auditory tube. When we talk about the attachments, there are certain muscles which are attached. There are certain muscles which are attached to the entire auditory tube. So this is the cartilaginous part of the auditory tube. the cartilaginous part of the auditory tube. So this is the bony part, the cartilaginous part of the auditory tube. This is the pharyngeal end, as we can make out. So as I have already told, the pharyngeal end here, the roof, the medial wall and the floor is made up of the elastic cartilage. This entire thing is made up of elastic cartilage. Now this is the lateral wall. So this is the lateral wall, which is made up of the fibrous membrane. So this entire portion, the medial part of the cartilaginous tube, is called as the medial lamina. It is called as the medial lamina of the auditory tube, whereas the lateral portion, which is made up of the fibrous membrane, is called as the lateral lamina of the auditory tube. Lateral lamina of the auditory tube. So there are some structures attached to the medial lamina and lateral lamina of the auditory tube. The medial lamina of the auditory tube receives the attachment of the muscles, namely the levator valli palatini muscle. Number 1 is the levator valli palatini muscle. Number 2 is the tensor tympani muscle, and number 3 is the salpingopharyngeus. So these are the three muscles which are seen attached along the medial lamina of the auditory tube. I repeat, the medial lamina of the cartilaginous part of the auditory tube receives the attachment of three muscles. Number 1 is the levator valli palatini, the tensor tympani and the stylopharyngeus. It is you can just remember it as LTS. L stands for levator valli palatini, T stands for the tensor tympani, and S stands for the salpingopharyngeus. Whereas the lateral lamina of the cartilaginous tube receives the attachment of only one muscle, which is called as the tensor valli palatini muscle. The lateral lamina receives the attachment of the muscle called as tensor valli palatini muscle. So this is about the attachments of the auditory tube. I repeat, the cartilaginous part of the auditory tube gives attachment to the muscles. The medial lamina receives the attachment of the levator valli palatini, the tensor tympani and the stylopharyngeus, whereas the lateral lamina receives the attachment of the tensor valli palatini muscle. So this is about the attachments. In this diagram, we can see the auditory tube is seen reaching the nasopharynx by passing through the space below the base of the skull. As I have already mentioned, the auditory tube, that is the cartilaginous part of the auditory tube, is located in the sulcus tubae. From the sulcus tubae, the auditory tube, that is the cartilaginous part, is seen to reach the nasopharynx by passing below the base of the skull, beneath the base of the skull, through the sinus space between the base of the skull, the sinus space which is seen between the base of the skull and the superior constrictor muscle. That space between the base of the skull and the superior constrictor muscle is called as the sinus of Morgagne. So the sinus of Morgagne, which is a space or the sinus space present beneath the base of the skull and the superior constrictor, allows the passage of the important auditory tube. This auditory tube reaches the nasopharynx through the sinus of Morgagne, and it is seen piercing the fascia, that is the buccopharyngeal fascia and the pharyngobasilar fascia. So, in the sinus of Morgagne, the auditory tube pierces the buccopharyngeal fascia and the pharyngobasilar fascia to reach the nasopharynx and ends up as the pharyngeal end of the tube. So this is the atlas picture where we can see this opening, that is the pharyngeal end of the auditory tube. This is the nasal cavity, the oral cavity here, the soft palate. This is the nasopharynx, the nasopharyngeal part of the pharynx. We can make out the opening of the auditory tube, which is the pharyngeal end of the auditory tube seen here. Just above the pharyngeal end of the auditory tube, there is an elevation which is called as tubal elevation or torus tubaris. So torus tubaris is a small tubal elevation which is seen just above the pharyngeal end. As I have already told, this pharyngeal end of the auditory tube is located just below and behind the inferior concha. So this is the inferior concha. Just behind and below about 1.2 centimeter lies the location of the pharyngeal end of the auditory tube as seen here. This is again the deeper dissected view showing the auditory tube. As we can see here, the cartilaginous part of the auditory tube reaching the pharynx beneath the base of the skull through sinus morgagne, reaches the lateral wall of the nasopharynx. We can make out the pharyngeal end. We can also see here carefully the attachment of the levator valli palatini to the medial lamina of the auditory tube. So the levator valli palatini is the muscle of the soft palate which receives its attachment from the medial lamina of the auditory tube, the salpingopharyngeus as well. So we can see the attachment of the levator valli palatini. We can see the attachment of salpingopharyngeus muscle. So this is the salpingopharyngeus, levator valli palatini, both of which are seen to take its origin from the medial lamina of the auditory tube. Along with these two muscles, the tensor tympani also receives attachment from the medial lamina. Next, moving on to the blood supply of the auditory tube. The arterial supply of the tube is mainly supplied by the branches of the middle meningeal artery, the artery of the pterygoid canal, and the ascending pharyngeal artery. So, the arterial supply is mainly by the middle meningeal artery and the artery to the pterygoid canal, and also the branches from the ascending pharyngeal artery as well. So all these arteries supply the auditory tube. The venous drainage of the auditory tube is mainly by the pterygoid and the pharyngeal venous plexus, by the pterygoid and the pharyngeal venous plexus. So this is about the arterial and the venous drainage of the auditory tube. Next is the the nerve supply of the auditory tube. The nerve supply of the auditory tube, the entire tube except the pharyngeal end is supplied by the glossopharyngeal nerve via the tympanic plexus. I repeat, the entire auditory tube except the pharyngeal end is supplied by the ninth cranial nerve, that is the glossopharyngeal nerve, through the tympanic plexus. And only the pharyngeal end is supplied. The pharyngeal opening is supplied by the pharyngeal branch of the pterygopalatine ganglion. It is supplied by the pharyngeal branch of the pterygopalatine ganglion. So this is about the nerve supply of the auditory tube. Next, the lymphatic drainage. The lymphatics of the tube drain into the retropharyngeal and the deep cervical group of lymph nodes. The lymphatics tend to drain into the retropharyngeal and the deep cervical group of lymph nodes. Retropharyngeal and the deep cervical group of lymph nodes. Regarding the functions of the auditory tube, the auditory tube mainly maintains the equilibrium of the air pressure on either side of the tympanic membrane. At rest, the tube usually remains closed, but during the act of swallowing, yawning and sneezing, it reflexively opens. It also protects the middle ear by preventing the transmission of the high sound pressure from the nasopharynx to that of the middle ear cavity. Clearance of the middle ear secretion is also the active function of the auditory tube. As the tube is lined by the ciliated columnar epithelium, the cilia of the mucosal lining beats in the direction of the nasopharynx and drain the secretion of the middle ear into the nasopharynx. So this is about the functions of the auditory tube. Lastly, moving on to the clinical importance of the auditory tube. Sometimes the tube is seen blocked during the inflammation of the tubal tonsil. During the tonsillitis condition, the tube is usually seen to be blocked, and this produces the disturbance in hearing due to the retraction of the tympanic membrane. So the condition called as retracted tympanic membrane arises during the infection of the tubal tonsil. Persistently reduced air pressure of the middle ear may be corrected by the periodic introduction of air through the auditory tube, which is done by the means of the metallic catheter. So by the use of the metallic catheter, the air pressure is tried to maintain on either side of the tympanic membrane, thus reducing the retraction of the tympanic membrane. So this is about the clinical importance. The tube acts as the channel of infection from the nasopharynx to the tympanic cavity, particularly in children, which is to be kept in mind. So this is all about the clinical importance of the auditory tube. So this is all about the auditory tube, including the clinical significance of the auditory tube. Thank you.